A murder in plain sight, yet no one speaks. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Share in the intrigue. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices bring this mystery alive. Let's begin the tale. I've never been one to dwell on the trivial details of people's lives, unless, of course, those details involve the price of a drink, the length of a case, or the number of orchids in the brownstone. But when a man walks in, stiff as a board, with a look on his face like he's either about to confess to something or get caught with his hand in a cookie jar, you can't help but take notice. It wasn't until I saw his fingers twitching at the edge of his coat that I decided to stand up and take a proper look. My name's Archie Goodwin, and I'm Nero Wolfe's assistant. Or, depending on how you look at it, his eyes and ears. Wolfe, of course, is the genius who solves mysteries while staying firmly planted in his chair, his vast mind spinning in ways I can't quite follow, but I keep him grounded. And I should tell you, there's nothing I hate more than interruptions in the brownstone. It's bad enough that the place smells of book dust and fresh coffee, but when some eager beaver decides to grace us with his presence, I have to wonder what they're trying to pull. This time, it was a Mr. Carlton Sloane who came calling, and by the way he carried himself, I could tell right away he wasn't from around here. Too crisp, too clean, like someone who had just walked out of a magazine ad for financial institutions. He didn't even make it to the top of the stairs before I stopped him. "What do you want, Mr. Sloane?" I asked, putting on my best "I'm too busy to care" face. He blinked a couple of times, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe," he said, eyes darting nervously around the hallway. He wasn't just nervous. He looked like someone who was used to things going his way, but wasn't sure if he was stepping into a lion's den or a museum. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't see just anyone," I told him, giving him a look that should have warned him off. But no, he was determined. He stepped closer, then glanced over his shoulder like he didn't want anyone overhearing. "I believe I have something important," he said, lowering his voice, "and I need Wolfe's discretion." Discretion? Now, that's a word I like. It means there's something to hide, something worth investigating. I raised an eyebrow, just a little, and that was enough for him to continue. "I'm being followed," he muttered. "Not by the police. I have personal matters that need to be resolved. I want your—" Mr. Wolfe's assistance. I couldn't help it. I felt a small spark of curiosity. Anyone who needed Wolfe's assistance usually had more than a passing interest in getting out of a jam, and they weren't shy about asking for help. Still, this guy wasn't giving me the full story. But it was only after I let him stand there for a moment that I stepped aside, letting him walk past me and into the office where Wolfe was waiting. Wolfe was there, naturally, without so much as a twitch of recognition. His chair was tilted back as always, and his eyes were focused on a book, I suspect, that had absolutely nothing to do with the case at hand. As usual, he didn't bother to look up. That was one of his charming qualities. Nero Wolfe didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter. Sloane was still standing awkwardly at the door, unsure of how to approach. I leaned against the wall, making myself comfortable, and waited for Wolfe to speak first. It usually made things more interesting that way. "Well," Wolfe's voice broke the silence, smooth and heavy, but not unkind. "You're here. Now, what is it you want, Mr. Sloane?" Sloane cleared his throat, and the tension in the room thickened. He walked toward Wolfe's desk and set down a small leather case, keeping his eyes down, almost as if the chair across from Wolfe was too intimidating to sit in. He was either uncomfortable with the surroundings or hiding something that wouldn't sit well with the man who owned this place. "I have a problem," he began, his voice tight with urgency. "A serious one, but it involves more than just me." Wolfe's eyebrows lifted. Just a hair. That was all. He didn't need to say anything else. Sloane could feel it. The detective's quiet scrutiny had a way of making people spill their guts without ever asking a single question. I could see the man struggling with whether or not he should lay it all out, but after a beat of silence, he did. "I believe someone is planning to kill me," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to be believed or if he was just looking for a way to back out gracefully. "I don't know who, but it's been suggested to me." Wolfe sat still, his hands folded over his belly. A moment passed before he spoke, his tone flat, but with a bite that you could cut with a knife. "And you want me to solve this before it happens?" Wolfe asked, as though he were asking about the weather. "I want you to stop it," Sloane corrected, leaning forward now, suddenly more forceful. "I've heard whispers, seen things. Someone is getting close. I need your help, mister." Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at Sloane for a long, quiet moment, letting the silence fill the room. For a man like Wolfe, silence was as much a weapon as any deduction. He leaned forward ever so slightly, finally breaking the stillness. "Mr. Sloane," he said, his voice thick with authority. "I'm interested. But your reasons for seeking my help must become clearer. You are not yet trustworthy." Sloane flinched, but Wolfe's words were not an invitation to retreat. They were a signal that the game had begun. The tension was palpable, and I was certain this case would have more than just one layer to peel back. Sloane's hesitation was palpable, but like a man who'd already walked too far to turn back, he swallowed and nodded, the weight of his words hanging between us like a ticking clock. "I'll explain everything," he said, his voice almost desperate now. Wolfe nodded slowly, a barely perceptible smirk tugging at his lips. This was just the beginning, and as always, the game had already begun. Sloane took a seat, shifting uneasily as though the chair itself might be a part of the conspiracy. He fidgeted with the leather case, tapping it lightly against the edge of Wolfe's desk, all the while stealing glances at both Wolfe and me. But Wolfe, sitting as always with that immovable presence, watched him with a sort of cool detachment that would have made most men break under the pressure. Not Sloane. He was made of different stuff, but I could tell the edges of his composure were beginning to fray. "Start from the beginning," Wolfe said, his tone more commanding than inviting. Sloane hesitated, his fingers twisting the case open and closed like he was trying to find the right words or perhaps simply stalling. Finally, after a long pause that seemed to stretch on forever, he spoke, but his voice wasn't the confident one I had heard earlier. It was soft, vulnerable even. "It all started a few weeks ago," he began, his gaze now fixed firmly on the desk, not meeting either Wolfe's or mine. "I'm an executive at a company, and we've been expanding. Big mergers, lots of money, the kind of thing that draws attention, especially when some people don't like the way things are going. I started receiving anonymous letters. Nothing too direct at first. Just vague threats, warnings to back off from the merger or there would be consequences." "Consequences," I repeated, just to prod him along. "What kind of consequences?" "Unspecified," Sloane muttered, as if the mere thought of those letters disturbed him. "The kind that make you look over your shoulder every time you walk into a room, wondering if someone's following you, waiting for the right moment. It gets under your skin, Mr. Goodwin." I nodded, keeping my thoughts to myself. Wolfe, of course, didn't react at all. His eyes remained steady, focused, as he watched Sloane closely. And then, Sloane continued looking up at Wolfe now. It escalated. More letters, and then something more concrete. A yellow chair. A yellow chair? Wolfe's voice was as steady as ever, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes, a sharpness that Sloane noticed immediately. "Yes, a yellow chair," Sloane said, his voice tightening again. "It was in my office. A very specific chair I've had for years. I sat in it every day. It was a simple thing, really, just a regular chair, but it had significance to me. One of those small comforts that make you feel grounded, you know. Only one morning I came in, and it wasn't where I'd left it. Now Wolfe shifted slightly, adjusting his posture ever so slightly in a way that was impossible for anyone to miss. I could tell he was fully engaged, the wheels turning. Something about the yellow chair had caught his attention, and that wasn't a good thing. "Someone moved the chair?" I asked, just to keep the conversation flowing. "Yes, but more than that," Sloane replied quickly, clearly eager to unload the full story. It was positioned differently, not just a little askew, but it was sitting directly across from my desk, facing me. "As though someone had been waiting for me, and no one admitted to it?" Wolfe asked, still as calm as a lake at dawn. "Not a soul," Sloane said, his voice lowering even more. "And I checked. None of my employees would have done that. It wasn't just the chair. It was the way it was done, as if whoever did it was trying to send me a message I couldn't understand. I couldn't help myself. So, someone moved a chair in your office, and you're certain it's connected to the threats. All this because of a yellow chair." Sloane nodded, his face pale. "It sounds ridiculous, I know. But the next day, there was a note taped to the seat. Just 2 words. He stopped, waiting for the suspense to build before finishing. 'You're next.' I stared at him. And that was it? That was it. But that's when I knew it wasn't just a joke. It wasn't some office prank. Someone was out to get me. And it wasn't just some minor threat. It was personal. Someone knew too much. Wolfe didn't speak at first, his expression unreadable, but I could see his mind working. The subtle signs were all there, the way he was tapping the tip of his fingers against his chair's armrest, the way his eyes narrowed just a fraction. He was piecing things together, but he wasn't in any rush. No, Wolfe liked to savor a case, letting it marinate until he had enough to deliver the final blow. "So, you're telling me," I said, leaning forward a bit, "that someone is targeting you through a chair and a few notes? No direct threats of violence, just psychological games. And you want Wolfe to solve this?" Sloane's eyes darted to me, his jaw clenched tightly. "I don't expect him to solve it overnight. But I need someone who can think strategically, who can see beyond the obvious." Wolfe nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I see. And who else knows about the chair?" "Only my secretary, Anna," Sloane answered quickly, his gaze sharp. "But she's been with me for years." "I don't think she's involved, of course," Wolfe said with the faintest smile. "And the company? Who stands to lose the most from your merger?" Sloane shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as if considering the question. "My main rival is Charles Montague. He's been pushing for the merger to fail. He stands to gain a lot if it doesn't go through. But I don't think it's him. I don't know." Wolfe made a small sound of acknowledgement, his eyes flickering to me. He didn't need to say anything more, and neither did I. Sloane was a man under pressure, a man whose nerves had been frayed by more than just a yellow chair. But there was something about his story, the strange, almost theatrical nature of the threats, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sloane wasn't telling us everything, and that was the most dangerous part. "All right, Mr. Sloane," I said, standing up and moving toward the door. "You'll have our attention." Wolfe doesn't take kindly to nonsense, but I'm sure he'll take this seriously. We'll need to dig into Montague and anyone else in your circle, and I'd start thinking about who could be close enough to pull something like this off. "Trust no one," Sloane stood, his eyes following me. "I'll do that. Just don't let them get to me first." I didn't need to say anything more. I closed the door behind me as I left the room, and as I walked down the hall to fetch Saul Panzer, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case wasn't just about a chair. It was about something much darker, something Wolfe would unravel, piece by piece. I left Sloane's story lingering in the air, unanswered questions weighing heavier than his initial fears. The man was nervous, but it wasn't just about a chair and a few cryptic notes. No, there was something deeper at play, something pulling him, pushing him, maybe even trapping him in a game he didn't fully understand. Wolfe was already ahead of me. I could tell. He'd have the pieces of this puzzle sorted in his mind while I was still fumbling around for the edges. I found Saul Panzer in the usual place. His office, where the walls seemed to close in on you from every angle, stacked with piles of unfiled reports and unfinished cases. He was hunched over a desk, scratching out a report when I walked in. Saul was good at what he did, quiet, discreet, and always willing to get his hands dirty when Wolfe needed him to. So when I asked for help, I knew I could trust him. I relayed the details I had. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask too many questions. Saul just nodded, taking it all in. By the time I finished speaking, his face was already hard with concentration, his mind clearly working through possibilities. He was sharp, that one. "So you think Sloane's getting the runaround, huh?" Saul said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. "But why the yellow chair?" "There's got to be more to it than that." "That's the problem," I replied. "I don't know. But the chair's the key. Sloane's not giving us the whole story, and Wolfe knows it. We need to dig into his company, see who stands to benefit from this whole mess." Saul grunted, pushing himself up from his chair. "I'll make some calls. You think Montague's behind this?" "Could be," I said, rubbing my chin. "But we need to look at everyone around Sloane, not just his rivals. Look for anyone with access, anyone who might want him out of the way. And don't forget that secretary of his, Anna. She might know more than she's letting on." Saul waved a hand as he grabbed his coat. "I'll check in with the usual sources. See if Montague's got any skeletons in the closet." He paused, a wry smile crossing his face. "And I'll make sure to dig around Sloane's office, see if anything's off with that chair." "Good," I said. "We'll need everything. Keep it clean." Saul, with that, he was gone, leaving me standing there, feeling the weight of the case settling in my bones. Wolfe wasn't one for small talk, so I knew he'd be waiting. I made my way back to the brownstone, the air outside feeling thicker than usual, as if even the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, sitting in his chair, the very picture of calm. His fingers were steepled in front of him, and the faintest hint of a smile was playing at the corners of his lips, though whether it was amusement or something else, I couldn't tell. "Have you spoken to Saul?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I did," I said, taking a seat across from him. "He's on it. But Wolfe, there's something about Sloane that doesn't sit right with me. He's hiding something." Wolfe's eyes flicked to me, sharp and unwavering. "I'm aware, Archie." I frowned, not sure if that was meant to reassure me or simply point out the obvious. Wolfe never missed anything, and he rarely bothered to explain himself unless there was something more to it. "So what's the next move?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "We wait. And in the meantime, we watch." "Watch?" I repeated, feeling the suspense build. "You're telling me we just sit here?" "Not quite." Wolfe's voice remained steady, almost conversational. "We observe, Archie. There is more to Sloane's situation than he is willing to admit. We must wait for him to make the next move." I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Waiting wasn't exactly my forte, especially when it came to something as unsettling as this, but if Wolfe wanted to wait, I knew it wasn't without reason. "You're sure he'll slip up?" I asked, my voice edged with impatience. Wolfe didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. All men eventually reveal themselves. The trick is in knowing when and how. I leaned back in my chair, trying to shake off the feeling that we were on the cusp of something dangerous. The air inside the brownstone had thickened, no longer comfortable and inviting, but stifling, as though something unseen was pressing down on us from all sides. I knew Wolfe was right. Sloane had to reveal more if we were to catch the truth. The only question was how long it would take for him to do so, and more importantly, how much longer could we afford to wait before someone got hurt? I paced for a few minutes, frustration gnawing at me. Every instinct I had screamed that we needed to make a move, but Wolfe never rushed. He'd seen enough cases to know that the right moment was always just around the corner. I couldn't help but admire that about him, even as it drove me crazy. Before I could take another step, the phone rang, breaking the tense silence. I shot Wolfe a quick look, but he didn't move. I answered on the second ring. "Goodwin," I said. It was Saul, his voice low and clipped. "I got something, but it's not good, Archie. You better get over here." I hung up the phone and turned to Wolfe, who had already risen from his chair. He didn't need to say a word. We were both already moving before I could think of anything else to say. Whatever Saul had found, it wasn't going to make this any easier, but it would make it clearer. I could feel it in my gut. The case was about to take a turn, and whatever Sloane was hiding, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The cab ride to Saul's office felt like it took an eternity. The streets were bustling with the usual noise, but inside the car, the world felt muffled, the air thick with anticipation. I could see the same tension etched in Wolfe's face as he stared out the window, his thoughts clearly a few steps ahead of mine. He wasn't one to speak unless it was necessary, but I knew the silence wasn't just from disinterest. It was a silence that spoke of a mind working overtime, calculating possibilities and piecing together the fragments of a case that had yet to fully reveal itself. When we arrived at Saul's office, it was as expected, dark, cramped, and reeking of cigars and stale paper. Saul was pacing near the window, his eyes darting back and forth between the street outside and the mess on his desk. He didn't even look up when we walked in. "I've got it," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I found something big." Wolfe raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for Saul to continue. I stood by the door, arms folded, a nervous energy bubbling inside me. Saul's tone had a weight to it that made me uneasy. This wasn't going to be one of those little nuggets of information that could be tossed aside. No, this was something worth paying attention to. Saul walked over to a small cluttered desk and picked up a folder, his hand shaking slightly as he handed it over. "This," he said, nodding toward the file, "is about Sloane's business dealings. Specifically, his merger with Montague's company. There's something not right. I dug a little deeper and found out that one of Sloane's main investors, a man named Donald Radcliffe, has been funneling money to Montague for years." I took the folder, flipping it open carefully. The documents inside were a mess of figures and contracts, but it didn't take long for the truth to surface. Radcliffe, the quiet backer who had always kept his name in the shadows, had a direct line to Montague. More than that, he had been working with Montague to destabilize Sloane's company from within. "How did you get this?" I asked, still processing the gravity of the information. "I have my ways," Saul said with a smirk, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "I traced a few transactions, spoke to a few people, and found a paper trail long enough to strangle someone with. Sloane's not just being threatened by Montague, Archie. He's being undermined from every angle, and that yellow chair." It's part of the distraction. I looked at Wolfe, who had been quiet through the entire exchange, his eyes narrowed in thought. He wasn't reacting the way I expected him to. There was no exclamation of "aha," or even the faintest hint of surprise. He was calm, too calm. "And Sloane knows about this?" Wolfe asked, his voice low, calculating. "Does he?" I said, looking back at Saul. Saul shifted uncomfortably. "I don't think so. At least not yet, but he's been getting close." Too close. And that's why I think the chair's more than just a threat. It's a warning. Stay out of it, or things will escalate. Wolfe's lips curled slightly. Interesting, he murmured. He stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket as though the weight of the case had just shifted a little more in his favor. This is where the game begins. Saul gave him a puzzled look. What do you mean? You've given us the edge, Wolfe replied, turning toward the door. But it's clear that Sloane is not entirely a victim in this. He's playing his own hand, and I have no doubt that he's aware of the greater game at play here. Our next step will be to confront him, but with a different angle. Confront him? I repeated, trying to catch up. You want to talk to Sloane now, before we've even figured out everything? Wolfe didn't answer immediately, his mind already racing ahead. It's time to put him to the test, he said. He's had too much time to hide the truth. Now we see if he's honest, or if he's merely another player in this game. The tension in the room grew as Wolfe turned to leave, and I followed, Saul trailing behind. The air felt thick with expectation, every step heavier than the last. Sloane had been waiting for us to take the bait, and now we were about to catch him in his own trap. We arrived back at the brownstone just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the entryway. Sloane was waiting in the parlor, as though he had never left. His face was drawn tighter than before, his fingers tapping nervously against his thigh. He had obviously been stewing over something, likely the implications of his latest round of deception. You're early, he remarked when he saw us. Have you figured it out? Wolfe didn't waste time with pleasantries. He moved to the center of the room, his presence commanding. No, Mr. Sloane, but we've discovered something of interest. Sloane stiffened, his eyes narrowing just slightly. What do you mean? You're not the only one playing this game, Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. There's more going on here than you're willing to admit. You've been working with Montague through Radcliffe, haven't you? Sloane's face shifted, just for a second. But it was enough. That slight twitch, the brief panic in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't expected us to find out, and now that we had, the truth was about to come crashing down around him. But it wasn't just Sloane who was in danger now. We were all trapped in this intricate web, and it was only a matter of time before someone made the wrong move. Wolfe's smile deepened, and I could see the pieces of the puzzle locking into place. Now, Mr. Sloane, he said calmly, shall we finish this? Sloane's expression faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Wolfe to notice. He remained motionless, his gaze unwavering, as if waiting for Sloane to make the first move in a game that had already been set into motion. You've been working with Montague through Radcliffe, Wolfe repeated, his tone almost too calm. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. Sloane stood frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of the armrest of the chair like it might be his only lifeline. I could see his pulse quicken, the color draining from his face. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, each word from Wolfe tightening the noose. I don't know what you mean, Sloane managed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Wolfe took a step forward, his hands still clasped behind his back, the picture of quiet dominance. You're not a fool, mister. Sloane, neither am I. So let's dispense with the lies. You've been setting up your own demise while Montague works to destabilize your company, and all the while you've kept us busy with this absurd distraction about the yellow chair. I saw Sloane's gaze shift toward me as though seeking some kind of ally, but I wasn't his ally, not anymore. He'd made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. He began, but Wolfe cut him off, his voice sharp as a whip. No more lies, Mr. Sloane. I'm not interested in your feeble explanations. We know you've been playing both sides. Wolfe's voice dropped, becoming almost soothing. The question is, why? Sloane swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Wolfe and me. He seemed caught in a vice, unable to escape, his mind working desperately for an answer that might save him. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice shaking now. "I was trying to protect everything, protect my family, my legacy. Montague promised me. He promised he would back me, give me a larger share in the company if I helped him, if I made sure Sloane Enterprises folded the right way. Radcliffe was part of that plan. He's been handling the money. Wolfe didn't flinch. So you've been manipulating the situation from the inside, pushing your company toward its downfall, all for the sake of a bigger cut." Sloane lowered his head, unable to meet Wolfe's gaze. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his deceit finally becoming too much to bear. "I never wanted it to go this far," he whispered, almost to himself. "I thought I could control it. I thought if I kept the merger going, I could come out on top. But I didn't expect Montague to take it this far. He's been taking over everything. And now I'm stuck in the middle." Wolfe's expression softened just the slightest bit, but his words remained as sharp as ever. "You've made a dangerous game of this, mister. Sloane. Not just for yourself, but for everyone involved. And you thought you could hide behind a chair, behind empty threats." "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," Sloane protested, his voice breaking. "The threats, the chair, it was all a warning. A message to me, to make sure I stayed in line. I didn't think anyone would take it seriously." "You were wrong," Wolfe said simply. "You underestimated not only Montague, but us as well. You've made one too many mistakes." The silence in the room thickened, each of us waiting for the next move. Sloane had laid it all bare now, but there was still the question of what to do next. Wolfe didn't seem in any rush to deliver judgment, but I knew the game wasn't over yet. Sloane shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What happens now? What will you do with this? You've got all the evidence." Wolfe's eyes flicked to me, then back to Sloane. "You're in a very precarious position, mister. Sloane, the fact that you've come to me with your tale of betrayal doesn't absolve you. Your actions have consequences." Sloane's face twisted in panic. "Please, I'll do whatever you want. I'll make it right. I'll tell you everything. All the details. Just please don't expose me. Don't ruin my life." Wolfe's lips curved ever so slightly into a faint smile. But it was not one of sympathy. It was the smile of someone who had just won, the satisfaction of knowing the game had reached its conclusion. "Oh, I'm not the one who will ruin your life, mister. Sloane. That's something you've already done yourself, but perhaps there is a way you can make amends." Sloane looked up at him, desperation flickering in his eyes. "You'll help me." "You'll help?" Wolfe interjected. "No, but I can offer you a choice. You will go to the authorities and turn over all the information on Montague and Radcliffe. You will confess your part in this. Otherwise, I will make sure your involvement becomes public knowledge. The choice is yours." Sloane looked as though he had just been struck. The reality of Wolfe's words seemed to hit him all at once. He could see no way out of it. The power that had once been in his hands had slipped away, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. "Do it," Wolfe said, his voice unwavering. "It's your only way out." Sloane's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might crumble entirely. But then, with a resigned nod, he stood up, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his choices. He knew the game was up. He had no other option but to play the final hand Wolfe had dealt him. As he left the room, I turned to Wolfe, who was already moving toward his desk, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. "Well, Archie," he said, the faintest edge of amusement in his voice. "Another case solved. Though I have a feeling this one may come back to haunt us before all is said and done." I couldn't help but smile. Wolfe always had the last word, and this time it had been a master stroke. Sloane left the brownstone that afternoon, his shoulders heavy with the burden of his decisions. The look in his eyes as he walked out the door was one of a man who knew he could never go back to the life he'd known. Wolfe didn't waste any time with pleasantries, and neither did I. We stood there in the quiet aftermath, letting the weight of the case settle in. The silence between us was comfortable, yet thick with the knowledge that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Wolfe had called it correctly. Sloane might have walked into the brownstone a man desperate to hide his secrets, but he left with those secrets laid bare. But while Sloane's confession might have closed the door on him, it had opened several more. This case was far from finished. "I don't trust him," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Sloane's confession feels too easy. He's a slick operator. He didn't spill everything just because Wolfe asked. Wolfe didn't react at first." He sat in his chair, as he always did, hands folded neatly across his stomach, his gaze focused on the collection of orchids sitting near the window. I could tell he was thinking, letting the pieces of the puzzle shift in his mind before making any moves. He was never one for rushed conclusions. "You're right," he said after a long moment, his voice cool and composed as ever. "Sloane is not an innocent man, nor is he a fool. He has motives beyond those he has shared with us. We may have uncovered the surface, but the true depth of this matter remains hidden." I leaned against the door frame, watching Wolfe carefully. "So, we wait for him to make the next move?" Wolfe's eyes flicked to me, and there was a glint in them that I recognized well, the thrill of a challenge. "We don't wait. We act. There are pieces missing, and it is only a matter of time before Sloane or his associates slip up." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "The next logical step," Wolfe said slowly, "is to find out what Montague truly stands to gain from this merger. We know he's been working with Radcliffe to bring down Sloane, but it's not enough. We need to know why he's willing to go to such extremes. It's time to dig deeper into Montague's past, his dealings. There's a thread we haven't pulled yet." "And Radcliffe?" I asked. Wolfe's lips curled just slightly. "Radcliffe is a minor player in this game. We will deal with him once we understand Montague's real motives. For now, I want you to visit the bank where Sloane's investments were handled. We need to find out if Radcliffe has been siphoning any money, or if Montague has been hiding something under the surface." I couldn't help but feel a slight thrill myself. Wolfe's plan was methodical, precise, just the way he liked it. And I, of course, was always ready to chase down the next lead, no matter how tangled it seemed. I left Wolfe in the study, his mind already moving forward, and headed to the bank. The task ahead seemed simple enough. Get a list of Sloane's transactions, find the connection to Radcliffe, and see what it led to. But nothing was ever simple when you were dealing with Wolfe's cases. When I arrived at the bank, I found myself standing in front of an imposing stone building, the kind that always made you feel like you were walking into the past. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, orderly, a perfect reflection of the place's power. The manager, a thin man with pince-nez glasses, met me in the lobby, his eyes immediately assessing me as if I were the latest in a long line of intruders. "Mr. Goodwin," he greeted me with the kind of practiced politeness that could chill you if you weren't careful. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to look at the records for Sloane Enterprises," I said, pulling out my ID, "particularly the ones involving Donald Radcliffe." His expression didn't change, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled with the request. "I'm afraid that's confidential, Mr. Goodwin." I wasn't about to back down. "I don't think you fully understand. This is not a request. It's a need-to-know situation. If you'd rather I involve the authorities, I'm sure they'd be happy to help." The man hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of his desk. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "I'll see what I can do." He led me through a labyrinth of narrow hallways, past rows of filing cabinets that had clearly been in place for decades. When we reached the records room, he handed me a thick folder and made an excuse to leave. likely realizing this wasn't going to be a simple transaction. I opened the folder, and almost immediately, a series of numbers jumped out at me. Unusual, irregular transfers that seemed to be funneled into an account under Radcliffe's name. But it was the dates that caught my attention. These transfers were made at precisely the times when Sloane had been under the greatest stress, when Montague's takeover attempts were the most aggressive. I had what I needed. The thread had been pulled, and now I could see the whole tangled mess unfurling before me. Montague wasn't just trying to bankrupt Sloane, he was trying to take over his entire company, and Radcliffe was the tool he was using to do it, but there was more at play here than just money. I hurried back to the brownstone, the folder in hand, knowing this case was far from over. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous the game became. But with Wolfe in charge, I was certain we'd see it through to the end. And when that moment came, we'd be ready. I made it back to the brownstone with the file clutched tightly in my hand. The evidence of Radcliffe's involvement with Montague spread out before me. Wolfe had been waiting for me, of course. It was late by the time I returned, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, his mind clearly turning the pieces of the case over. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. I laid the file on his desk, the contents spilling out like a tangled web. Wolfe didn't immediately move to look at it, but I knew he was aware of its contents. He was always 5 steps ahead, already piecing together the puzzle I had just started to unfold. "You were right," I said, breaking the silence. "Radcliffe's been funneling money to Montague." It's all here. The transfers line up with the times when Sloane was at his weakest, right when Montague was making his move. But it's more than just money. It's like Montague's been systematically buying out Sloane's company bit by bit, making sure he has enough leverage to force him into submission. Radcliffe's his muscle in all of this. He's been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Wolfe's eyes flicked to the file, then back to me. He made no move to look at the details, his expression unchanged, but I could tell he was already thinking about the next step. "Radcliffe's involvement is a predictable turn," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Montague's reach was never going to be limited to just intimidation. He needed someone who could handle the financial side of things, someone who could act from the shadows. Radcliffe was the obvious choice. "Yeah," I agreed, rubbing my temples. "But it's still not enough. We need to figure out why Montague's going to all this trouble. What's his endgame?" Wolfe stood up, his large frame moving gracefully toward the desk. But he didn't sit. Instead, he picked up the file and flicked through it methodically, as though he were reading a story he'd already written. His mind was already racing ahead, turning over every detail, examining it from every angle. "Montague wants more than just Sloane's company," Wolfe said slowly, his voice a quiet rumble in the room. "He wants control. This merger isn't just about money. It's about power. He wants to own the board, to manipulate the entire industry. But there's something else. There's a personal stake in this. A personal stake," I repeated, trying to follow his train of thought. "What do you mean?" Wolfe glanced at me, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had just made a critical connection. Montague's connection to Sloane goes beyond business. It's personal, as it often is with these kinds of men. I didn't need to ask him to elaborate. Wolfe never spoke unless he was absolutely sure. The pieces were starting to fall into place. "Do you think Sloane knew this? That Montague had a personal motive?" I asked, already knowing Wolfe's answer. "No," Wolfe said softly, his gaze returning to the file. Sloane was too blinded by his own ambition to see what was truly at stake. He underestimated Montague, thinking he could control the situation. But Montague's power isn't just in his wealth. It's in his ability to manipulate others. Sloane was just another pawn in his game. I let out a sigh, frustration building. So, we've got a man who's trying to destroy another's life for power and revenge, and we're supposed to just let him go. Wolfe turned, his face calm and composed, but there was a hint of something sharper behind his eyes. Not quite. We don't let him go, Archie. We expose him. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Wolfe wasn't about to let Montague off the hook. He wasn't the kind of man who just solved mysteries for the sake of it. When Wolfe got involved, it wasn't just about solving the case. It was about delivering justice in his own inimitable way. We'll need more, I said, more to myself than to Wolfe. Sloane's confession isn't enough. We need a way to make sure Montague doesn't slip through our fingers. Wolfe raised an eyebrow, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. What do you suggest? I'll dig into Montague's past, I said, feeling a surge of determination. There's got to be something we can use against him. Maybe he's got skeletons in his closet that will make him panic. Wolfe's smile was slow, almost imperceptible. I believe you will find something, Archie. I have no doubt. But do not underestimate Montague. He will fight back. We will need to be precise. I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Montague was dangerous, but he had no idea just how dangerous Wolfe could be when he was cornered. We were getting closer to the truth, but the closer we got, the more perilous the game became. I could feel it in my gut. The final confrontation was coming, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Let's get to work, I said, turning toward the door. We've got a monster to expose. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt the weight of the case pressing down on me again. But this time, it was different. We were no longer chasing shadows. Wolfe had already figured out Montague's game. All that was left now was to bring it all into the light, and once it was exposed, there would be no escaping it. The next few days passed with a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. Wolfe stayed in his chair, as always, brooding over the case, his mind turning the new details over like stones in a stream, letting them settle before making his next move. I spent my time digging deeper into Montague's past, using every contact I had to uncover something, anything that might expose his real motivations. The man wasn't a fool, and I had no doubt he'd been hiding something behind that polished exterior. It wasn't long before I found it. A series of old business deals, ones that Montague had kept well hidden, indicated a pattern of manipulation. In each case, he'd used financial leverage to destroy smaller competitors, taking their companies from within before buying them out for pennies on the dollar. But the real kicker came when I stumbled across a list of names. People who had disappeared or been silenced, their companies quietly dissolved after Montague's involvement. The dots were there, if you were willing to connect them. Montague didn't just want Sloane's company. He wanted something far more dangerous. He wanted to control everything. I returned to the brownstone that evening, the evidence in hand, but as I walked through the door, something felt off. The place was too quiet, too still. Wolfe was in the study, his hands clasped together in front of him, the ever-present smell of orchids hanging in the air, but the usual tension I'd grown used to wasn't there. Instead, there was an odd, almost palpable stillness about him, as if the calm before the storm had settled in. I set the folder down on the desk in front of him, my fingers brushing against the paper with a soft rustle. "I found something," I said, but Wolfe's response wasn't immediate. His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me, a glimmer of something in his gaze I couldn't quite read. "I already know," he said softly. I blinked, surprised. "What do you mean, you already know?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers gently tapping against the edge of his desk, the soft sound somehow more unnerving than the loudest of silences. "I've known for some time now, Archie. Montague's game was never about Sloane's company. That was just a stepping stone, a means to an end. I've been watching him closely, piecing together the moves he's been making, and it's become clear to me that he's targeting something far bigger. I felt the air shift as the weight of his words sank in. It wasn't just about the merger anymore. It was about control. But why? "You're talking about his broader scheme?" I asked, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place slowly. "Yes," Wolfe replied, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "Montague's been positioning himself for years. He's not just trying to destroy Sloan. He's been trying to take control of the entire industry, every asset, every competitor, every shareholder. He's been building his empire through these quiet, backdoor deals, manipulating people like pawns in a game of chess." Sloan was simply the last obstacle in his way. I sank into the chair across from Wolfe, the realization hitting me like a cold slap. Montague wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator, using people's weaknesses to manipulate and destroy everything in his path. But what was his endgame? And more importantly, why was Sloan still alive if he was just a stepping stone? "I don't get it," I said, rubbing my temples. "If Montague's already been taking down competitors, why keep Sloan alive? Why not just finish him off and take the company?" Wolfe's lips curled slightly, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Because Sloan's life is the one thing Montague can still control. He knows Sloan will fold under pressure, that he will eventually give in to Montague's demands. He's waiting for Sloan to make a mistake, a final betrayal, one that will give Montague complete control of Sloan Enterprises. But Sloan's biggest mistake was underestimating the lengths Montague is willing to go." I sat back, my mind racing. "You think Sloan's already made that mistake? You think Montague's got him on the edge of doing something he'll regret?" Wolfe nodded slowly. "It's entirely possible. But there's something else. Something we haven't accounted for yet. Montague's been too quiet recently. He's waiting for the right moment, just like we are. But I suspect that moment is closer than we think." I frowned, trying to process everything Wolfe had just said. It was all beginning to make sense. Too much sense. Montague had played his hand well, staying just beneath the surface. But now we were getting too close. He had to know we were on to him. "Where does that leave us?" I asked, my voice sharp with tension. Wolfe's eyes met mine, his expression unreadable. "It leaves us with one final move, Archie. We need to make Montague think he's in control, make him believe he can outsmart us, and then we strike. We'll let him come to us." I felt a shiver run down my spine as Wolfe's plan took shape in my mind. It was classic Wolfe, calm, methodical, and devastatingly effective. But it was also dangerous. Montague was a man who wouldn't hesitate to destroy everything in his path. If we were going to expose him, we had to be careful. One wrong move and the whole game could fall apart. But that was the challenge, wasn't it? To stay one step ahead, to outthink the other player before they even knew what hit them. I stood, feeling the adrenaline of the case course through me. "Let's bring him down, Wolfe." Wolfe's smile deepened just a little. "Indeed, Archie. Let's." The days after Wolfe's final declaration passed quickly, each one blending into the next with a kind of quiet intensity. We'd set our trap, carefully arranging the pieces in a way that would make Montague believe he had the upper hand, that he was still controlling the game. Sloan had been kept in the dark, his role in the matter reduced to that of a mere pawn who thought he could win, but was, in truth, already lost. Wolfe had a plan. Of course, he always did, but this one was different. It wasn't about direct confrontation. It wasn't about gathering evidence and presenting it in a neat package. This time it was about manipulation, subtle and precise, making Montague believe that the walls were closing in around him without ever showing our hand. We had made the right moves. I had found Montague's weaknesses, traced the tangled threads of his business empire, and watched him carefully as he began to feel the heat from all sides. He'd known we were closing in, but he didn't know how, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. He had been waiting for a moment to strike. Now he was about to get it. It was late in the afternoon when I walked into the brownstone, the door closing behind me with a soft click. Wolfe was already sitting in his chair, his eyes half-lidded, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. He had been waiting, not for me, but for the right moment to spring the final part of our trap. "We're ready," I said, placing the file I'd been working on in front of him. It contained the final piece, a report that would be the tipping point, proof of Montague's true intentions and the last nail in his proverbial coffin. The trap was set, and Montague would walk right into it. Wolfe didn't take the file immediately. Instead, he looked at me, the corners of his lips curling ever so slightly. "Are we, Archie?" I nodded, my heart beating a little faster. He doesn't know it yet, but he's already walking into the final act. We've made him believe the merger is his, that he's already won. Sloane's been fed just enough information to make him think Montague will spare him, just enough to make him think he's out of danger. Wolfe leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him as he studied me. His gaze was sharp, but the calmness of it made my nerves settle. "You believe Montague will play his part, then?" I didn't have to think about it. I knew the answer. Yes. He's been playing this game for too long not to finish it, even if he's unaware of how badly we've set him up. "And Sloane?" Wolfe asked, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. "Sloane believes his role in all of this is nearly over," I said. "He's been fed enough lies to keep him compliant. He thinks he's still part of the plan, that Montague will spare him when everything falls into place." Wolfe's smile didn't fade, but it grew sharper. "Good. It's time to end this. Then." The evening passed slowly, each minute stretching out as we waited for Montague's response. Wolfe had sent a carefully worded message to Sloane, urging him to meet with Montague for what he believed would be a final discussion on the merger. The stage was set for Montague's arrival, and with it, the inevitable confrontation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the door to the brownstone opened, and Montague stepped inside, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. He knew something was off. I could see it in the way he carried himself. That cocky arrogance that had been so visible in him throughout the investigation was now replaced by a subtle wariness. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew things were closing in on him. He looked at Wolfe, who hadn't moved from his chair, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Montague's barely contained nervous energy. "Mr. Wolfe," Montague said, his voice smooth but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "I trust you've called me here for a reason." Wolfe's gaze never wavered. "Indeed, Montague. We've reached a point where your participation in this game is no longer optional. You've been playing with fire for too long, and it's time for you to face the consequences." Montague's lips twitched, but he didn't move. "Consequences?" he repeated, almost with a hint of amusement. "What are you trying to imply?" Wolfe's voice was low but carried an undeniable authority. "That you've been outmaneuvered, Montague. That everything you've done, every step you've taken has been carefully orchestrated to lead you here. Your empire is built on manipulation and deceit, and now we've arrived at the endgame." Montague's eyes flickered, and I could see the realization hit him. The carefully constructed facade of control was beginning to crack. Wolfe had orchestrated this moment to perfection, making Montague believe he was the one in control, only to reveal the truth now that it was too late for him to do anything about it. "You're playing my game now, Montague," Wolfe continued, his voice smooth and final. "But it's over. Sloane's role in this is already compromised, and your plans, we've already exposed them. Your empire is about to fall apart, and all that's left is the fallout." Montague's face went pale, and I could see the cold sweat beading at his temples. The walls were closing in. He knew it. He could try to make a run for it, but it was too late. "You've lost," Wolfe said, a finality to his words that echoed in the room. Now it's time for you to answer for your actions. Montague's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was trapped, and no amount of power or manipulation could save him now. Wolfe had played the game to perfection. Montague had walked into his trap, and now he would pay the price. I stood behind Wolfe, watching as Montague processed the inevitable. It was over. Montague stood frozen for a moment, his mouth slightly open, his mind clearly racing for an escape he knew wouldn't come. Wolfe's calm, methodical words had shattered the last of his bravado, and for the first time since he'd entered the brownstone, I saw a flicker of true fear in his eyes. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey, and Wolfe had made sure of that. "You don't get it, do you?" Montague finally managed, his voice strained but defiant. "You think you've beaten me, but you're wrong. You're just one step behind. You don't know what I'm capable of." Wolfe's smile didn't falter. He leaned back in his chair, his hands still steepled, his gaze never leaving Montague. "No, Montague, I know exactly what you're capable of. It's just that your schemes have been outplayed and your time has run out. You've left too many tracks for anyone paying attention to miss. You've always believed you were the smartest man in the room, but now you're just another man trying to figure out how you're going to face the consequences of your actions." The silence that followed was thick, charged with the weight of Montague's realization. He stood there, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for some avenue of escape, but every possible exit had already been closed off. There was nowhere left for him to hide. "You're finished, Montague," I said, stepping forward. "You've got nowhere to turn. You thought you were the one pulling the strings, but you were just a puppet in a much larger game. Wolfe set you up, and you never saw it coming." Montague's eyes flicked to me, his gaze cold and calculating, but the anger in his expression had melted into something far more dangerous: desperation. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "You think you've got it all figured out, but you're wrong. It's not over. It's just begun." "Is it?" Wolfe's voice cut through Montague's threat like a razor. "The only thing that's just begun is your reckoning. You've made one too many enemies, Montague. People you thought you could control, manipulate, destroy. But they're all watching now. Your empire is crumbling, and you're going down with it." There was a coldness to Wolfe's words, but it wasn't the coldness of victory. It was the coldness of inevitability. Montague had been a player in a game far bigger than he had ever realized, and now the house of cards was collapsing. Montague seemed to catch himself, his posture stiffening slightly, as if trying to regain a semblance of control. But the facade was gone. The man who had once commanded a room with his presence now seemed like a hollow version of himself, empty and defeated. "You don't have all the pieces, Wolfe," Montague muttered, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "You think you know everything, but you haven't even begun to understand what's really going on." Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "Explain, Montague. What is it that I've missed?" For the first time since he'd walked into the brownstone, Montague looked almost human. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the bravado that had once made him seem untouchable faded. He was starting to crack, and Wolfe knew it. He was pulling Montague into his web, inch by inch, using the man's own arrogance against him. Montague took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for what he was about to reveal. "There's more at stake than just a merger, Wolfe," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't just want Sloane's company. I wanted something else, something far more valuable." Wolfe's eyes flicked to me and then back to Montague, his interest piqued. "Go on." Montague seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though weighing his options. But the desperation in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He had nothing left to lose. He was going to spill everything. "I've been working with people who you don't even know exist," Montague admitted, his voice low. "People with far more power than you could ever imagine. This was never just about Sloane. This was about control over the entire market, the industry, the very infrastructure that holds it all together. I've been setting the stage for something much bigger, something that goes beyond just one company. Wolfe sat back, absorbing Montague's words without flinching. I see. So, you've been playing a much larger game than I realized, and these people you speak of, are they the ones who are behind the scenes pulling your strings, or were you their puppet? Montague clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. You think I'm just a pawn in someone else's game? I'm not some puppet. I've been the one calling the shots. I've manipulated every move, every deal, every betrayal. But it's not enough. They've already started moving in, and He broke off, as if realizing too late that he had just revealed far more than he intended. Wolfe's smile was almost imperceptible. The game, as you call it, has been played out, Montague. You've already lost. The only thing left is to see if you'll be able to face what's coming. The shift in Montague's expression was almost imperceptible. But I could see it clearly, the realization that no matter how many cards he'd stacked in his favor, he was out of moves. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing left to do but watch it fall apart. You'll never get away with this, Montague spat, his voice a venomous hiss. Wolfe simply stood up, his demeanor as calm as ever, his voice low and final. It's already over, Montague. The pieces have fallen into place, and you're the one who set them up. Now it's time for you to face the consequences. Montague's eyes flickered with one last attempt at defiance, but it was hollow, fading with every word Wolfe spoke. The game was over. Montague's shoulders sagged as Wolfe's words landed, and for the first time since he'd entered the brownstone, I saw him as something more than just a power-hungry businessman. He was a man caught in the web of his own making, trapped by the lies and schemes he'd spent years carefully constructing. His final attempt to escape the inevitable had been exposed, and there was no way out. You think you've won, Montague muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But you don't know the full picture. You don't understand what I've done. Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He simply studied Montague, his gaze unwavering, as if he were watching the final act of a play he already knew the ending to. I could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, as Montague's defiance began to wither, his bravado cracking under the weight of his failure. You're right, Montague, Wolfe said, finally breaking the silence. I don't know everything, but I do know enough. Enough to understand that your empire was built on a foundation of manipulation, lies, and betrayal, and in the end, that's what brought you down. Montague's eyes darted nervously, but he said nothing. Wolfe had stripped away the last of his defenses, exposing him for what he truly was, nothing more than a man who'd gotten too greedy, too arrogant, too sure of his invincibility. The real Montague, the one who thought he could control everything, had been exposed, and it wasn't the mastermind he had hoped to present. It was a man with no escape, no power left. We've exposed your dealings with Radcliffe, your manipulation of Sloane, and your attempts to control the market, Wolfe continued. We've seen the way you've worked from the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes, setting up your empire to fall into place just the way you wanted. But in the end, it's all crumbled. And now you'll face the consequences of your actions. There was a long pause, and for a brief moment Montague looked like he might say something, plead for mercy, perhaps, or try to bargain his way out of it. But instead, he simply slumped further in his chair, defeated. His eyes seemed empty, drained of the bravado they had once held. I'm done, he whispered. It's over. Wolfe didn't offer him sympathy. Instead, he gave Montague a final, measured look. A look that spoke of justice, not revenge. Yes, Montague, it's over. But it doesn't have to be the end for you. You still have a choice to make. Montague's head snapped up, his gaze sharp despite his exhaustion. A choice? Tell me what you've been hiding, Wolfe said, his tone quiet but firm. The people you've been working with, The ones who've been pulling the strings behind all of this. If you want to have any hope of making amends, now is your chance to come clean." Montague hesitated, his face twisting in conflict. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, clinging to whatever scraps of pride he had left, but then his shoulders slumped again, and he nodded. "I don't have anything left," he murmured. "You've got it all?" Wolfe didn't press him further, but the quiet acknowledgement from Montague was enough. The truth had been uncovered, and Montague's role in the grander scheme had been exposed. He had no more tricks up his sleeve. He was out of moves. As we left the brownstone that evening, I could feel the weight of the case finally lifting. The quiet hum of the city outside felt almost surreal after the tense atmosphere that had hung over us for so long. Wolfe was still quiet as we walked, his mind undoubtedly turning over the final pieces of the puzzle. "Well, Archie," he said, breaking the silence, his voice low but thoughtful. "Another case closed, and another empire brought to its knees. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? How people believe they can control everything, that they can outwit others, only to be undone by their own arrogance." I couldn't help but smile. "That's the thing with you, Wolfe. You always know when someone's playing a game they can't win." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's not the games they play that interest me, Archie. It's the way they think they're in control, even when they've already lost." As we reached the door to the brownstone, I glanced over at Wolfe. His mind was already moving on to the next thing, already processing the next case, the next challenge. He had done it again, unraveling a web of lies and deceit, exposing the truth when no one else could see it. The door closed behind us, and the brownstone fell silent once more, the quiet that followed always reminding me of how much I had yet to learn. But for now, the case was over. Justice had been served. And in the end, Wolfe had won. Again.